Hi everybody, I'm Oobah Butler and welcome. Thanks so much for coming. This is basically the launch of Colony Sound, which is the latest from amazing artist Freeman and Lowe. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Jonah Freeman.
And I'm Justin Lowe.
Yes, so there you go. More experienced. It'd be good maybe if you could explain the whole, I think just the concept to understanding this whole thing might just be the concept of San and where that came from would be a good thing to explain. Because from what I gather, this is like the maybe fourth piece of work within that universe.
Yeah, with several bodies of work have been based on this concept of San, which is a fictional city, and it's an imagined city as if San Diego to San Francisco had merged into one giant metropolis. And it was actually an idea that was first put forth by Herman Kahn in his book, The Year 2000, which was written in 1967. And he was a futurist, and he had imagined that in the year 2000 there would be all these mega cities around the world. And there was Boston to Washington, which was called Bosh Wash, and then San Diego to San Francisco, San. And of course they didn't really come to fruition like he imagined. But so we took this kind of 60s idea of the future and just sort of extrapolated on that and made this sort of fictional world in which we've made several films and several bodies of work.
It's quite hard to figure out when you're reading through all your stuff like what's actually fact, what has come from Herman Cahn's mind or yours. Is that like intentional?
Yeah, there's always a mix of fact and fiction, and it's always presented in a very matter-of-fact kind of way, so it's not to sort of show our hand as to what is what, and so there's always should be like a sort of second guessing of, is that real or is that fake kind of thing. And it's sort of faux anthropological like work is what we would generally call it. And I think that, yes, it's generally focused on the Cold War history into our present day, and Colony Sound is no different. And so starting with a lot of the technological advancements that happened during the Cold War, and then the counterculture, which was a sort of rejection of that and trying to create a parallel civilization to that, and then how that has sort of merged into counterculture coming into sort of consumer society and the internet and all the various things that we enjoy now.
And is that like how many? What's the most like abstract idea that you put in there that's actually come from something that's like a reality or something that I genuinely can't figure out? San have made it up to me. Definitely Boss Wash. But
there's real theories that this guy had. Just in this show, Colony Sound, there's a concept of psychic driving, which sounds sort of made up, but that was a real thing, that a psyop of the American government, that they were trying to use sound to control people's minds. So they do repetitive sound messaging. They would just go on and on and on, and it would just go into people's heads, and they thought that they could get people to like sort of control their behavior or, induce a certain psychosis or whatever it may be. And they did the same thing with LSD, and of course it never really worked out as they wanted it to, and it was abandoned. And then in some ways, like, LSD became part of the counterculture. So psychic driving, that kind of repetitive sound, could then be like house music or something like that,
Yeah, in the charts in this world, there's a song which is a dub mix of a track that used to be used to brainwash people. Is that right? It got to number 3 in the charts.
Yes.
No, 23.
Yeah.
Sort of people are willingly succumbing to subliminal messages, which I guess is honestly runs throughout a lot of new age music. The way that these things start off and the way they end up couldn't be further from I think their intentions. And so I think that's another thing to play with here.
It's quite interesting. I think the whole concept of the smile seems pretty, as an idea, seems pretty damn important. If we can think about this one, so could you kind of describe what it is?
Well, the smile is this idea of a biological communication network. There was an underground biological communication network.
Is this real?
this is not real.
Okay.
But it is riffing off of this idea of mycelium, which is considered to be one of the world's largest organisms, which is a kind of a networked plant system where they communicate with each other. And so the idea is that this network is hacked and is used to transmit various forms of entertainment, or eventually would be used to transmit different forms of entertainment.
Yeah, and it mirrored like the trajectory of Cold War technology. So it was first developed as a secret communication network, one that would be used by spies or one that would be used by the military, which of course like aerospace and microchips and all these things were developed by the military for war, and then they get sort of co-opted by consumer like technologies, and then they're co-opted by counterculture, and they sort of morph in their use. And that's the same idea as the smile, except it's instead of being an electronic signal through the communication network, it's biological.
Yeah, it felt interesting as an idea to be, I don't know, I just trust it immediately more than the kind of a contemporary tech, like a digital technology, because as you kind of says that it's, in theory, it is kind of made to be unhackable because it's organic.
Right.
You can't like access it, right? Is that the whole idea?
And there are certain things that are linked to, like if you listen to people who are theorists of artificial intelligence and things like that, there's general belief that the analog, which is biological, is analog, is a much more stable technological system than a digital. Like the digital will break apart and is hackable, and it doesn't transmit as much fidelity than analog. And so a lot of ways the belief is that AI will become biological. So in some ways, this could be something coming soon.
There's like a lot of ideas where, I don't know, it seems like, I know that it's sort of like it's kind of like post-apocalyptic, isn't it? The like aesthetically, to me it seems like, well, I don't know, it's everything.
It's more like absolutely current in a way.
Yeah.
You know? Which,
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes feels a little post-apocalyptic for sure. But I think that it's more about trying to tease out some of the hidden elements of what's actually happening today, right now.
Yeah,
Right.
it's more parallel and less like sort of a speculative future or anything like that. Dystopian is often applied to the work we do, which I don't necessarily think is always appropriate because I think it has the full spectrum.
Yeah. I thought it was quite, I was going to say I think it was quite optimistic in a way.
Yeah.
There's something quite nice about it. The fact is that like the secret to cracking the smile is the fact that they invented a plant-based transistor.
Yeah.
And then there was like this whole idea of I listened to something earlier on one of the former projects set in the same city about an explosion which gave birth to change the landscape of Los Angeles and kind of turned it from an arid landscape into this kind of load of flora and fauna and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, teeming with hummingbirds.
Yeah.
Right.
And that just seems to me more optimistic than what's going on.
There's
now.
optimism in there for sure. I think especially with the installations, we try to get a real like spectrum of experiences where you go from environments that are very abandoned and decrepit to things that are very like beautiful and fancy, and you know you'll have retail, you'll have domestic, you'll have all kinds of things. So you're getting a sort of almost like a full range of urban environments. Not a full range, but a variety.
So for anybody that like hasn't seen, including me, the whole kind of setup for this installation that's at the Marlborough Gallery now, what does it look like in terms of the amount of rooms, the amount of different spaces, that kind of thing?
There's 11 rooms, and I think that the first room, you do a real double take because it kind of draws upon what's naturally already in that neighborhood. It looks like a retail store, like a phone store. But on closer look, the phones are strange. It's the beginning of what will be a repeated kind of element of this hybridization between biology and technology. So the phones are of this sort of strange, almost like if Gordon Ramsay was like plating a cell phone. There's a sort of almost like a salad-like twist to it, you know. But it's all kind of roots, and you know, I don't know, that's sort of the first indication that things are going to get weird.
What, and from that being point A, like, where's the point B the weirdest thing? The thing you enjoyed coming, sort of putting together the most?
You know, we utilize a lot of areas that aren't allowed for the public.
Usually in the space.
Yeah, so there's an element of just how you navigate the actual architecture of the building and giving people access to places that they shouldn't be and creating links into places that are normally separated so that nobody really by the end knows where they are. The the original structure has completely been wiped away. So that sort of disorientation helps to amp up, I think, that sort of feeling of paranoia and looking closer, wanting to find out what's really going on or wondering what's really going on. So, for instance, you walk out a window and you're outside and then you walk in through another window. So, we were just talking to someone today who was commenting about the song, Where Every Window Is, There's a Door, or something. I didn't know it either. But it sounded apropos.
One of the things that I got just from the other work was it's quite a lot of humour in there. It feels like I found myself laughed. I had to write a couple of things down because I wouldn't remember, sorry. I'm good, but I'm not that good. I'm not good. So there's book titles on a bookshelf in one of the pieces called, I think it was in the Scenario in the Shade, maybe this is, which is another one of the installations from the same. So New World Fertility Cults, that made me laugh. Neo-realist liars, that was good. Tijuana Eye Patch, that was a good one.
Bestseller.
Yeah.
And there was just like one of them, there was a series of framed pictures on the wall, and in the pictures there were just the corners of rooms, which I don't know why, but it just really made me laugh.
That actually wasn't intended to be funny, but
it's just funny. It's a funny thing to hang on your wall.
yeah.
Is it humour something you like to use? Like, why?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to amuse ourselves mostly.
Right.
And I think it's because a lot of the work can be very drab and it's very dense, and it's sort of to pepper it through so you have little bits of levity as you're moving through these environments.
Sure. There was you told me about on the phone the other day about a kiosk, and there's stuff in Chinese all behind it. This was in another installation.
Oh, yeah.
In Black Acid Co-op,
which is
we had like a community board, like an old school community board where you'd have like sheets of paper where you could pull a little tag off and it would say like
cell phone numbers, right?
Like help wanted, do you want shelves made or something like that. But we just wrote it out in Chinese and we translated A Season in Hell by Rimbaud in Chinese on this community board. So, which we thought was funny.
It was funny. So just from the newest exhibition, is there anything in particular which you were hoping would bring people that kind of amusement?
Well, there in the first environment, Metrovision, which is this telecommunications superstore where you could buy these plant-based cell phones kind of thing. There's a lot of text that is meant to be kind of advertising text that is reshuffled around, and it's on light boxes and it's vinyl on the walls, and that has some weird phrasings that are sort of meant to be, I think, a little bit funny.
What like?
That's a good question.
Yeah, there's so many. Like the French conniption.
The French.
Let's see. There's the Rainy Day Maria. So there's a lot of riffs on song titles, like, instead of Velvet Underground, Sister Ray, we've got Sister Moray. And I don't know, High Entropy Breakfast is pretty good. That seems to be confusing people on the streets.
Yeah. Connecticut nerdcore.
Is that genre?
That's a genre, yeah.
Yeah, where do you get all the shit from? Like it's so much stuff. It's
Like
so
the
eclectic.
actual objects?
Yeah. Where do you build out? Like, where are you sourcing this stuff?
All over the place.
Yeah,
It's just,
that room, that all came mostly from Rhode Island. I know, when we were making the films, the trilogy of films, you know, we made all the installations to shoot them all. And so we had a crew of people in vans just driving around, picking up stuff on the side of the road, maybe. If I guess that's when they got good. When they, you know, because they knew that they just had to look in the real world and not necessarily go shopping, and that their eyes were always open, looking for anything that might be usable. So all over the place. We just got done doing this giant bunker in Ohio, and so we kind of got that state pretty dialed in for shopping. Once we also were shopping in Miami, and it's, you know, it's about getting things that are from someplace else that you might not be able to really have access to in something like New York, you know?
Sure.
the world now that, you know, the retail is on getting depressed. There's a lot of stores going out of business, so there's a lot of like asset liquidators who are going and buying stuff like that. A lot of
There's that silver lining that I was looking for.
yeah, there's stuff like that. You know, architectural salvage. You know, if you have like if people are like redoing their home and they're pulling out like kitchens or they're, you know, whatever. There's just, I don't know.
There's kind of a whole dead mall circuit that we've been on. So
Yeah.
we're almost just taking, you know, that's how we got this kind of duty-free aesthetic, you know, so something like that room, for instance.
That was a Gucci store that was being ripped out to become a Balenciaga store, and we took the Gucci.
Yes, and we have kind of a network of people, you know, that because once you see this stuff, then you start to see the world as some kind of a reflection of it in some way. People really, I think, have become a little bit infected by the mindset of the projects, right? So people will send photographs or say, hey, there's a Petco going out of business. You want to get, you know, some kind of a autopsy table for pets, which, you know, we do.
And, you know, once the concept for these shows comes about, you have the various genres of rooms, so you could say, like, well, I'm going to make an Upper East Side apartment, or I'm going to make a kitchen, or I want to make a retail environment. Then you can start to focus in and look for the various details of that world. And then it's actually not that hard to figure it out.
Is there, I mean, it seems like since the beginning there's been a sort of strong connection with just the counterculture movement. Is there like any reason individually why you were interested and drawn to that as a sort of a movement?
Well, I think we're drawn to the music of 60s counterculture and then the many generations of that genre of music afterwards. And I think we just got interested in sort of where counterculture came from, like what made it sort of emerge out of the Cold War, and then where it's gone. And like, for instance, like you could say that the internet and internet culture is a direct result of a lot of the thinking around that emerged from 60s counterculture. So I feel like it's a good starting point to sort of think about some larger, you know, 20th century and early 21st century things that are seem to be crucial to the edifice of our existence.
And it's a kind of a robust kind of a, you know, menu option too. If you want to get into literature, so if you want to get into like underground press and start looking at people like the Diggers, you know, and the sort of intentional communities around San Francisco. Well, I think that they're essentially a bunch of poets that were trying to take care of all of the kids that were bombarding San Francisco, all the runaways. So people like, I think there's Peter Coyote was part of the Diggers. But so they started the sort of underground press, and that would be a launching point for a project that we did called Artichoke Underground, where we kind of recreated our own underground press. And so that's just one of these elements where you can kind of take a kind of a form that exists and then start to riff off that.
It feels like, yeah, maybe the first project, the lab project? What was kind of the thought with, how does that make sense to kind of counterculture?
Well, that Hello Meth Lab in the Sun was sort of, there was like 3 zones of that project. There was the meth lab, then there was this hippie commune that was constructed much like at Drop City, which was one of the most famous and first hippie communes. And then there was these various sites of industrial power, and one of which was like a very regal interior. And so it was sort of the relationship between the 3. And this idea that the industrial power was the thing that the counterculture was rebelling against, but in an idealistic sort of way, and it was a sort of creating a parallel society. And then you could say that the meth lab and drug culture sort of spun off from counterculture, but was completely nihilistic and lacked any any idealism whatsoever. It wasn't about remaking society. It was just about escaping. And homemade meth labs were using like readily available industrial products like Sudafed and cat litter and these things like that to make these really base drugs that were both dangerous.
That there's a lot of kind of a search and a transformation in all of these elements. So we were kind of thinking about alchemy in a modern context, and that led us to think like if this was some kind of like college seminar, what would it be called? And then they go, well, this big group community and psychosis, because they all sort of seem to share these 3 notions. And I think that we just try to present that in a material way. And in some ways, these become kind of materialist portraits of these groups, although it's not populated by actors and it's not theatrical in that sense.
Feels like maybe that, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe the Smile was maybe a sort of, there's a lot of the counterculture presented in the new project, and talking about Rastafarian bike gangs and what was the name of them? They're called The Fort. The
Fort.
Fort. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about the Fort?
Well, the Fort was this idea of a sort of dropout society that existed on the outskirts of the metropolis of San, and they were making their homes out of refuse and all that, but then they were really savvy with electronics and computers. So what would look like a shanty town was really like a complex computer system, and so that's the Fort.
Yeah, I just maybe that it felt like there was something. It was presented as kind of an alternative to the internet in a way. To me, the Smile. I don't know if I'm right. I could be wrong, but and I felt they were very, because they're just sources of communication.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the inspiration for at least for this project was to sort of think. We had really covered the San and its sort of like in its youth cultures and its power structures in a certain way, and what we hadn't really gotten into was the media environment, and I just sort of thinking about how much media is dominating all of us all the time. Like it's almost this kind of like, it's hovering above our reality at all times, like being in phones or on TVs or whatever. It's sort of, it's almost this extra dimension that we all live in. And so what is that dimension within the San and how? And so what is the hardware that makes up this media state? What's the content? Like how did it go from being, how was it developed? And then how was it co-opted by counterculture? And then how was the counterculture co-opted by a greater capitalist system, that kind of thing?
It seems like everything always goes into the same patterns of you present this idea of this counterculture, and then this great thing, these kind of, it's kind of brought back together by this by a community of immigrants within San, right? And then that then gets co-opted by a load of people who are trying to sell wellness products.
A deranged wellness program, which I feel like we're all inundated with all the time, right?
It's sort of like microdosing with Gwyneth Paltrow or something.
Yeah.
We're all goofers nowadays, my friends.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it just seemed like it kept painted for me a little bit of a depressing portrait of what happens to the counterculture, and what do you think there's even room, like does it even exist anymore, a counterculture in internet? age.
But
Well-
if it does, we don't really know about it.
It's not in the way that it did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or in 20th century idea of counterculture. I think is gone.
Right.
Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer, once said that the Bohemia is the dream space of industrial society. And since we're in kind of a post-industrial society, that maybe there is, like, Bohemia is kind of no longer relevant. But we're living with the effects of it all the time. We're living with the music, we're living with the art, we're living with the, the internet, and to a certain degree is a product of the counterculture. So we're still living in it. It just, I don't think, exists in the same kind of like the negation, the sort of binary negation of mainstream culture for a counterculture. It seems to not apply anymore.
It's strange, isn't it? Because within the lifetime of that generation, it's been born and feels like it's died. a bit
Yeah.
much.
I mean, I don't know if died, but morphed into something else, right? It's sort of, things are atomized now. It's not so like one and the other, like this, It's something else. What it is, I don't know.
Well, now they own the companies that they were
They,
trying to
they,
take
um,
over.
they're making a lot of money off it, yeah.
Well, that's like a funny thing about some place like Esalen, which was a real hub of this kind of experimental thinking, that it now is a place that's been sort of occupied by people that used to work for Google who feel really bad about what they did.
What is the story? Esalen?
Esalen was like where you might have people like Stanislav Grof or John Lilly who were doing experiments with psychedelics to try to really map the human consciousness. But we're also experimenting with different forms of yoga or chanting or meditation or astral projection.
Right, okay.
It's kind of the original wellness center.
Okay.
It's a retreat in Big Sur, California, and so a lot of the original ideas of the New Age movement started there. And so interesting and major things went on there. But now it is, like a retreat for guilty tech people.
There's some journalists that are like Vincent Bevins used to do all this stuff for the LA Times and stuff. He talks about how if the Soviet Union hadn't have fallen, then there would have been the tech companies on the west coast of America maybe would have had to develop the internet with more. It would have pulled it slightly into a place of responsibility. Maybe feels like, or just change the way it is today. But it feels like maybe you guys are presenting an alternative of how, at the crossroads of the Cold War, things could have gone differently.
They certainly could have, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what, that wasn't a question. So I'm just going to say differently, like an Australian. So there's quite a lot of, as you're saying throughout, like it's hard to figure out, what is actually being within what's being presented is fact, or whether it's just something that you guys have kind of kicked off from that book and gone into your minds about. There was something we briefly mentioned the other day, but when you were doing the piece called Bright White Underground, and you sent out the press releases to that, and there was an interesting story that you told me about.
Well, Bright White Underground was a piece we did in 2010 in Los Angeles, and it took place in a Schindler house, so it wasn't in a gallery, it was in a home. And so we made up this whole narrative about somebody who lived in that house who was a doctor who was doing rogue psychedelic research in the early 60s. And it was based on things that were really going on in Hollywood at the time, where these psychiatrists would do these like LSD psychotherapy sessions and blah, blah, blah. So we made up this narrative about this guy and that he lived in this house and had been abandoned, and we were now resurrecting it, and we sent out a press release. And the New York Times published a little blurb about the show and used the backstory as though it were real. They didn't fact check it and just sort of said that this has really happened. And of course we were thrilled by that. But what was interesting is that we were really smitten by the fact that had happened, and this curator, Caroline Christoph Bukharev, who was curating Documenta at the time, came over for a visit, and we told her about that in a very excited way, and she was sort of not so pleased with it, and she's like, fake news can be really dangerous, and then went into some reason why fake news could be dangerous. And of course we're like, what? That's a buzzkill. And then of course now we're living in a world where fake news is really dangerous.
You guys have been doing it for years.
I know, this was 2010. This was,
Yeah, it's like the Russians,
full
man.
6 years before it really.
Yeah, is there any, would you, well obviously not with the beer, you wouldn't, within the climate now, I mean it was almost like a lot of the things that you've been doing have kind of, now that you're coming up for air from this San world that are actually being mimicked in the real world, is there anything you wouldn't do now that you would have done, or you did do when you were around?
No. We would still do it all.
Yeah. We might change how we do it, just understanding for endurance purposes, just try to take it a little easier.
Is there, if anyone wanted to get into, just the amount of sort of reading that you kind of alluded to when we chatted on the phone today, if anyone wanted to fully more understand the ideas within the work and the new exhibition in particular, is there anything you point them towards that you felt is particularly interesting?
Almost the entire body of Philip K. Dick, I'd say. That's always been a big one, right?
Yeah, William Gibson, I think, is a constant inspiration in the ideas in his novels.
William S. Burroughs and Brian Geisen together. Really just the cut-up techniques, which I know is like, it's probably something that everybody uses in some fashion, the sort of like free association and things of that nature. What else are we reading? There's Robert Anton Wilson in The Cosmic Trigger, which is deals with a lot of conspiracy theories, and but really on this sort of like 70s West Coast California kind of bizarreness, where you meet a lot of the historical characters.
Thomas Pynchon, The Crying of Lot 49 was sort of, in some ways, an inspiration for this, because that is about like a postal system, an underground postal system, which is, in a way, a communication network, like an ancient communication network. And it had this symbol, the bugle, that was sort of peppered throughout the novel, and no one really knew what it meant. And that's a technique that we employ in our installations, where we'll have logos or graphics or phrases or things that are repeated throughout, and they're seemingly opaque to someone who's just coming in, but then if you go deeper, you might find references and there's meaning behind it.
Okay, great. I think kind of. Oh yeah, have you got any plans to make DNA recalibrators into reality?
Well, I think it's been made into reality in some ways.
Yeah.
There's, when we made this DNA recalibrator, which is a fake product, back in 2010, I guess, when we did Bright White Underground. And now there's all this like Elysium and these various cellular health things like NAD that are out there on the consumer market, items that you can buy that are supposed to do DNA repair. So I take it.
Yeah.
Uptown Vitamins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any other of the fake products that I saw within it. I think I like the image of a. Why am I bringing this up? There's an easy listening record that's on the wall I think it was in Mercury City maybe, and it's just a fountain coming out of it. It was as if that was some sort of.
No, that's in the floaty chain. Mitch Miller.
Is it?
Yeah. That's Mitch Miller. Yeah.
That made me laugh.
Yeah.
But is there any products that you are waiting to become a reality? Kind of like what, it's the era of that, isn't it, with like Theranos and everything, and like you just come up with an idea, and then you hope that by the time...
We got a venture capital firm ready to give us some money. Yeah. That would be pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, because if there's any investors in the audience,
Yeah.
then these guys are here.
Well, we made an explosion in a photo studio in New York, and we photographed it using high-speed lights and then these high-resolution cameras. And so that allows you to freeze the objects in mid-explosion.
How did you get them to explode?
we used a thing called an air cannon. So it's actually not, it's just, you fill like a trash can basically full of items, and then you shoot like a really high pressured air, and it just bursts it into the air and flutters around, and then you just sort of fire the shutter just as the explosion goes. And in this case, we did like, I don't know, hundreds of frames of this explosion, and then you piece them together in post-production.
Are the films available online, by the way, the ones that I was watching earlier?
They are available through private Vimeo links, but they're not available.
Okay.
No.
I was going to say you should watch them, but okay. There's a humble brag there.
They show from time to time, but they're still, they're sold as art objects. So right now they remain private.
But we are open to screenings for sure. I mean, we encourage that.
Or if people come up and ask, we'll share a link.
Yeah, because they're all 25 to 30 minute pieces, original music from like Kurt Weill, MJ, all these kind of 70s influences.
It's a huge list of people. We worked very closely with Jennifer Harima from Royal Trucks, and she reached out to all of her friends, and they submitted tracks that were then mixed together. So Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream and MGMT, Endless Boogie, so like a local New York band that we all love.
Mayo Thompson from the Red Crayola.
Psychic Ills. It goes on and on.
The guy used to do stuff with Will Oldham a lot. So
Matt Sweeney.
Yeah, Matt Sweeney.
Matt Sweeney's a good friend of ours.
Yeah, that stuff sounded great.
Yeah.
It seemed like there's a lot of media though produced within them, because there's like 70s style, 60s style TV advertising products like, what's the psychedelic drug that you guys...
Marasa.
Which is a Haitian voodoo slang that means twin. And that's sort of this idea that there's these cactus crystal sculptures that are littered throughout the pieces, that this sort of is a first vegetable mineral hybrid, and that you can synthesize this drug Marasa from it. But that then becomes something that enters into the popular marketplace. So you might be able to get like some psychotropic contact lenses or, some really weird sunscreen.
Yeah, I like the image of just wires coming out of cacti. Sorry. Is there any more questions anyone's got? Yeah.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about your connections to the different rooms, sort of the holes in the walls that you create, and...
Well, I think, with a lot of these installations, you're creating sequences of rooms. So in this case, there's 11 rooms. In some cases, we've had up to 26 rooms. And they're often supposed to mimic a kind of urban condition where, we're all sort of in these buildings like slammed together. And if you busted through a wall, you might be in a totally different world. And so that's this idea. And we often think about these sequences when you move through these environments as when at each threshold is like a jump cut in a film. So you bust through this wall and you're in a totally different world, like a sort of portal to a new world. And
so you storyboarding this when you're kind of coming up with the whole thing? Is that how's the process?
Very much so. Yeah, it's almost like preparing for like an episodic television show where you have to have your kind of like a Bible of sorts, and you know where your narrative arcs are going to be, and there's tons of diagrams and a really intense image archive. I mean, for years we were just going around New York taking pictures of things, So we have all of those photographs of storefronts and different displays and, different kinds of empty peeling paint rooms. The good stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, that's really what we pull from a lot. Then, in answer to some of the breakthroughs in the rooms, as opposed to using doors, that's a bit of a riff off of Cabrini Green, which is a housing project in Chicago, where people were carving holes in the walls so that they could escape not only from the police, but from each other as well, and they could also stash drugs or weapons or whatever. And so that's sort of a way, like in Black Acid Co-op, which was our most kind of porous project, where you could see multiple rooms at the same time. It's sort of like a kind of a low-end cubism in a way. But this was sort of like, not that the acid, sure, maybe it was lysergic, but also it was like a dissolving, so many different kinds of perspectives what could happen at once. And you could choose to go in many different directions. While this piece has a very kind of specific trajectory because we're really responding to the architecture of the gallery, which is 2 floors that's broken up by a stairwell. But we wanted this to be one continuous piece.
Yeah, and I think there's also this idea, going back to Cabrini Green, where it was this housing project that was a very planned community that was intended to be like sort of low-income housing, and everybody was supposed to live in a very specific way, and it did not go the way they planned. And then the sort of street gangs and this new kind of civilization emerged, and that like resulted in them actually carving up the architecture to make a new world for themselves, which I think is a theme that runs throughout these projects.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is there a reason why drugs play such a heavy theme in all the work?
I think it's just an easy avenue in to talk about all the other things that we've been discussing this evening.
Yeah.
And they're sort of a time-based sensation, right? There's a coming up and a coming down, and so there's something kind of inherently cinematic about that. And that's, I think, is very applicable to these projects, where it is sort of a durationally based piece. And now there's a soundtrack or a sound component with this piece, and there's a certain kind of timing with the rooms.
Is that with the new
Yeah.
installation?
Yeah.
What is this? What is this?
Well, we worked with Elizabeth Hart and her husband Evie, and
Lee Scratch Perry played on a couple tracks. So
that's just what they were working on. Their friends, they kind of have come out of a couple different bands and are familiar with the work, and so it was just an easy collaboration. And I mean, they're kind of neighbors too. So there's our collaboration, but we collaborate then with a larger group of people, and the conversations are pretty continual.
not in a specific sense, no. I mean, there's sort of climate of politics, I would say, but I don't think we want to be so topical in that we're talking about a specific issue, whether it be, I don't know, like the 60s would be like the Vietnam War or civil rights or something like that, and then right now it could be abortion or getting Trump out of office or whatever. And I feel like in art, when you get so topical, you can get dated very quickly. So it's more like we want to get sort of more into the root of it all and less about the details of that. Hence this, this thing that we've done where we're always creating a parallel world where the structures are there, but the details have changed. It's likened it to be like going into a foreign country or something like that, where it's sort of like things look familiar, but then they're totally dislodged. Like it might be a different language, and the popular soda may not be Coke. It might be a different thing, but it looks sort of like Coke, and so you're having that experience, and therefore your senses are heightened, and you might see something different. And I feel like if we were to talk about the politics in a very specific way, that might just, it would not have the desired effect, I guess. But politics are there, I think. Rebellion is there, for sure.
Are you interested at all by, in terms of you saying, just because they are completely immersive experiences, have you got any interest in things like virtual reality or that kind of experiment with that?
It's sort of something that is always being tossed around as that technology develops more. I think people are really trying to kind of crack the code on how to make a narrative, how to really tell stories, but I don't really know enough about it. I think that people understand that things like vertigo work, like sensations work, but for now, the conversations will just have to keep happening. They don't really have a direct line on that.
If someone were to come and say, here's a bunch of money, make a virtual reality thing, I'm sure we would do it, but I don't use virtual reality in my life, and I don't have a particular affection to it, so I don't know. But, you know, sure, why not? I remember one experience I had in Korea in 2006 that really had this, a feeling that I wanted to replicate in an installation where I got there. I was in Busan for a biennial, and it just, you know, there were a lot of things seemed similar, but then completely foreign, and it had, I remember that just my senses being so heightened as I moved through the city, and so excited by every little thing, like the gum wrapper and this advertisement and the way that the buildings were constructed together, and just everything just, you know, it was in a way like a drug experience while not being on drugs. And it seemed like if you could, when we make these environments that you're going through it like that, your senses should be focused on every little detail. So that's why we go to so much trouble to create like all the packaging and all the signage and the floor and this and that, so as to really have it be like that experience. But it could happen in, you know, the Middle East. We've been in Istanbul and had similar, and Europe, even here in London, same thing. I mean, anytime you leave.
And also, you know, the United States is so large. When we first did our first project together in Texas, and we were in Marfa, which is this tiny little desert town, there's just strange elements of like how, like some very bizarre, I don't know what, like the ceiling that we made. There's this really bizarre ceiling that we have in this piece that's just like extreme joint compound. It makes no sense, you know? Like, there was some really weird stuff going on in that town. So like these restaurants.
Yeah. So it's always a way to sort of, your senses get heightened, which I think is important, and you get more sensitive to the world around you, which I think when you're in your home world, you kind of are just, you know, can glaze over a lot of details.
Thank you.